Today, we have the opportunity to connect again with James Bergeron, the president of the National Council of Higher Education Resources. That's NSHARE. James is an expert in higher education, and we brought him on the show today to discuss the Biden administration's next moves with regard to debt relief. So we'll get straight to that conversation. James, welcome back to the President's Forum podcast. Thanks for making time to join us and share your expertise.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hey, last week, an Inside Higher Ed reporter, Jessica Blake, she outlined the Biden administration's plans to address debt forgiveness. And this is the second attempt, really, that the administration has made to forgive debt. And our listeners may remember that the first attempt was ultimately stopped by the U.S. Supreme Court in the summer of 2023. So, this is round two. Can you tell us a little bit about what the department is thinking right now? I believe the rule was published last week, or maybe
on Halloween
earlier this week. In the Federal Register. What can you tell us about the details?
Yeah. So first of all, as you said, the proposed rule was published in the Federal Register on Halloween on October 31st, and it has a 30-day public comment period. So that will go into December 2nd. So members of the public have roughly, 3 weeks in order to kind of comment on the proposed rule. So as you said, this is Plan B from the Biden administration's effort to provide federal student loan forgiveness to borrowers who they believe have a federal student loan debt that's weighing them down, and it's contributing to more borrowers going into delinquency and default. This one differs pretty significant, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but in pretty significant ways from Plan A. And the first part of it is that this is one that's based on a determination by the Secretary that borrowers have hardship. So for short, we kind of call this the hardship rule. And under under some of the details of the proposed rule, the department's going to use a two-pronged test to determine whether or not borrowers have hardship and whether or not they're eligible for federal student loan forgiveness. And the first is an automatic process that the Secretary of Education would engage in to determine whether or not it's likely that borrowers will go into default on their federal student loans. The second is a application process that the Secretary would receive information from borrowers talking about the fact that, at least from their particular perspective, that they have hardship. In both cases, borrowers would be eligible for partial and full discharge of their federal student loans. And there's a pretty healthy list of what the department is going to use as it's going to define what hardship is. They're going to look at, for example, household income, assets, the type of loans that they have, the total balances on their loans, their current repayment status if they've been making payments on their student loans. They're going to look at their household income, whether or not they received a Pell Grant, other information that they've given on their FAFSA, the type of institution that they've attended, their student outcomes, and a kind of a other laundry list of factors that the department or that the Secretary of Education would look at. It's a little bit different than the Plan A. Plan A was, keep in mind that Plan A kind of had the income portion of it. So if you were, low income, you were eligible for $20,000. This doesn't have an income factor, though. We're thinking that hardship probably would be defined as economic hardship. There was also a limit within Plan A. This isn't a limit. This could the Secretary could provide either partial or full forgiveness. And third is that Plan A applied to all federal student loans. This only applies to federally held student loans. So those student loans that are held by the department. And so it exempts federal family education loans, Perkins loans, HEAL loans that are kind of, that are with lenders and kind of non-federal government. So there are some differences between the programs.
So it seems like the Secretary would have a tremendous amount of discretion to deploy this for federally held loans.
Absolutely. I mean, the department is kind of looking at a specific section in the Higher Education Act, which allows the Secretary to collect on federal student loans. And there's a little section that says, in in carrying out these activities, the secretary may, modify, waive,
Got it.
enforce, and and so the department is really kind of interpreting this word waive to come up with kind of a, two-pronged approach. And so it envisions a significant amount of discretionary authority that the secretary will entrust to forgive these loans. And that's a criticism that people have had about this plan, which is, and there's some guardrails here, but there's not a lot of, there's a significant amount of subjectivity that will
Right.
be involved in kind of approving, or at least determining who will receive loan forgiveness.
Well, I've read estimates that range between, this is going to, over the next 10 years, cost $112 billion. I think that was according to the proposed regulation.
Right.
That's what they said.
But
The committee
there
for
are other organizations, Wesley, who said that this potentially could cost 300 or 400 billion dollars, and
yeah,
obviously part of that's related to the fact that we've got the SAVE plan, which is in the courts, and that envisions some type of loan forgiveness too. So
right,
if that doesn't happen, then how does this kind of happen? And then that also envisions the plan B part point one. This is plan B
right,
point two because this is hardship. But there's another federal student loan forgiveness proposal that's being held up in the courts right now. And the hardship NPRM, which is a notice of proposed rulemaking, envisions that being in effect too. So
right.
if the SAFE plan doesn't happen and, plan B point one is struck down by the courts, you can see the hardship being the only thing out there. And then the cost probably would skyrocket pretty significantly.
Right, right. Okay, so there's a serious process that the department needs to go through if to finalize a rule. And I guess the most basic question is it possible for a Biden administration to complete that process before a transition of power to a Trump administration?
Yeah, it's going to be very difficult to do. I'm not saying it's impossible, but the federal regulatory process is administered by the Administrative Procedures Act. For your listeners, they don't need to know the details of this, just to know that there's a process that the department has to follow,
Right,
and they can't do anything before the public comment period expires on December 2nd. Then under the APA, they have to review all the rules, all the comments. They have to respond to everyone in batches. They have to send. But then they have to, make changes to the rule. They have to send that to the White House Office of the Management and Budget, the OMB, to
right,
review the rule. That process usually takes around 30 days because the public has the ability to meet with the White House during this review process to weigh in on the rule. Then it has to go back to the department for a final rule to be published in the Federal Register. So I'm not saying it can't take place, over the next, few weeks, but it's going to be pretty tight. I mean, could they have pre-cleared this with the White House? Yes. But they still have to go through all the public comments. They still have to, the White House still has to, do some type of cursory review to give the public time to weigh in person.
right. And it seems like with this, with a very limited amount of time left, and you have between that a significant chunk of that is holiday break.
Sure.
And I would imagine there are 1,000, I don't know, priorities that need to be wrapped up, tied up by the outgoing administration.
Sure.
I just don't know if it's possible at this point to get this through.
I don't think it is. I mean, most of the folks that may be working at the administration needs to find jobs to take care of their families too. So
Right.
I think that you're probably going to see people, with other priorities out there. I'm not saying it's not impossible, but the department's working on a few other, proposed rules. Not as important as this one for clearly, but they have not expedited those rules as well, just because of the time constraints they have.
Right.
And keep in mind that the new administration is going to come in and they're going to stop all this on day one. They're going to put a halt to kind of any publication, in the Federal Register, and they can easily put together or they can easily release interim final rules, clawing back all those rules.
Right.
And then Congress has the Congressional Review Act as well, which bypasses the filibuster in the Senate, that can nullify those rules and prohibit the department from ever regulating on this issue again. So
Great point.
Yeah. So it's
Great point. That could be exercised, and that could be, especially, as it looks like you have a Republican Senate and a Republican
yeah.
House.
But if I'm a Democrat, if I'm a Democratic senator, or even a Democratic representative, I'd be a little concerned of having kind of that bullseye where I could not regulate on this in the future. I kind of still want a little bit of flexibility, in 4 years
Right.
on that. So I find it very hard. I mean, it could happen. I've been wrong many, many times, but it's going to be a big, heavy lift for them to move forward on this.
I want to give you the final word here on a prediction or your thoughts on what does a Trump administration do with potential debt forgiveness?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, we all seen the kind of election returns where the Trump coalition, if we're going to call it that, is a very economically diverse coalition. It may not be as heavily college educated, but it encompasses a lot of working Americans and folks who may need lifelong learning, folks who may want to go to college. And so, I'm not necessarily, saying that the Trump administration is going to, close the door on all loan forgiveness efforts for the next 4 years. I mean, I think that they may be looking at different ways to provide forgiveness. That's a little bit more measured in what we've seen, prior to President Biden coming into office. That could be, a new program authorized by Congress or rewriting of the public service loan forgiveness program to base that, to have that be linked to, state-based careers. I just think that there's probably a lot of discussion that's going to happen over the next few months, talking about how do we, help those working Americans that may need lifelong skills. But I do think
Right.
that I think they're going to pull back on the proposed rule on hardship. I think that they're going to withdraw, the proposed rule on federal student loan forgiveness. I think that there's also a good chance that they're going to pull back on the SAVE plan. But they've got a lot to deal with the FAFSA rollout. That we've got 8 million borrowers in forbearance because of the legal challenges with SAVE, as we talked about in our last podcast. So this is, I think it's probably easier for them to focus on those other efforts.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. It makes a lot of sense. Well, James, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate this insight, and we look forward to having you back on when we have anything in your wheelhouse.
Thanks, Wilson.
The economics of higher education.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
The finance of it.
Yeah, thank you guys.